Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Chiwa Chihana, and I work at Opus Independence, the conveners of the Festival of Debate. The festival started running from the 16th of April, and it will go on until the 25th of May this year. And so far, we've had events that will add up to 65 events by the time we get to the end. This will have included by then at least 140 speakers and 50 partners. Now, the festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic, and political crises that we collectively face. And we want to create a space that explores and holds that complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of these events are free at the point of access. And where we need to charge, we keep the ticket prices at a minimal level. So if you'd like to make a donation to the Festival of Debate, please go to festivalofdebate.com. What we want to do is to tell new kinds of stories about the societal challenges and big opportunities for positive change we are seeing through these events. You'll get an email asking you for some feedback. Please fill it in so that we can improve, and that will inform some of our perspectives as well. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce you to tonight's event, Sharing Power, Spreading Wealth, Net Zero and Equity. And welcome your host, Lydia Garden.
Hi everyone, Prynawn da pawb. Thanks Chiwa, and thanks for the Festival of Debate for facilitating today's event. So hello everyone, a very well welcome to today's event, an important discussion, Sharing Power, Spreading Wealth, Net Zero and Equity. I'm Lydia Gordon and I'm the Economic Policy and Research Officer at the Institute of Welsh Affairs. So a bit of an introduction for those who don't know us. The Institute of Welsh Affairs is Wales's leading think tank with a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through policy research and advocacy, our online and print publications, which provide platforms for robust comment and debate, and agenda-setting events. We're a membership organisation with nearly 1,000 members across the country and far further afield. We are funded by our members, the events we run ourselves, and independent trusts and foundations. We're politically independent and don't represent a specific sector, trade, or interest group. Instead, we speak to bridge policy and institutional divides. We work with others to devise research and a new policy in order to develop a successful, green and fair economy for Wales and a healthy, confident and inclusive democracy. If you'd like to know more about what we do and support us, please join us as a member and help shape Wales's future with us. And so today we're joined by Dan McCallum and Grant Peasley, who will each be speaking to their experiences in delivering community-owned energy projects in Wales. And just to introduce each guest then, Grant is a social entrepreneur, localism practitioner and sustainable communities consultant. He is founding director of Datblygiadau Egni Gwledig. That was a bit dodgy. I'm a Welsh learner. Ani Teg, Ani Newydd, and Ani Llwy. In the past, Grant has helped to establish several social enterprises, including his local pub, Tîn Llan, which he helped bring into community ownership. He spent 5 years as Director of Community Energy Wales and more recently was charged with establishing Wyrdd Ni movement for community climate action across Gwynedd. In 2024, he joined the team establishing Ani Cymru, a publicly owned energy company for Wales. So welcome, Grant. And then also we have on the call Dan McCallum, who co-founded the award-winning Awel a Mantawe in 1998, a community wind farm project, and has worked for the organisation ever since. Developments include Awel Co-op Wind Farm, which took nearly 20 years, but was finally commissioned in 2017. Egni Co-op became the largest rooftop solar co-op in the UK over a one-year period in 2020 to 2021. Dan is also a founding director of Community Energy Wales and has previously worked for Oxfam in Iraq and in Sudan. He was awarded an MBE for services to community energy in 2019. And Dan is a qualified energy efficiency surveyor and has a degree in history from Oxford University. So thanks to both of you for attending today, and really looking forward to hearing what you bring to today's event and experiencing delivering some of these projects. So today we'll be outlining some of the recent research from the Institute of Welsh Affairs, which gives an insight into the future of energy generation in Wales, but really brings some policy learning for the rest of the UK, specifically on how we can generate energy in a just and an impactful way that benefits communities. So green energy generation presents many opportunities for a new, fairer energy system, with ambitious targets in relation to renewable energy generation from the Welsh Government and planned investment in renewable energy set to drastically increase over the next decade. The question is no longer about if we can decarbonise, but how we want to decarbonise our energy system. In Wales, the Welsh Government faces significant economic challenges with limited fiscal firepower, weak borrowing powers, and a budget pre-allocated to public service delivery. Meanwhile, the Welsh economy does not retain enough income from renewable energy generation. Therefore, as investment in renewable energy infrastructure projects must increase, this presents a moment of opportunity to reassess the current economic impact of such projects within Welsh communities and indeed across the UK, and explore ways to ensure that Wales and communities across the UK retain a fairer share of the incomes generated through commercial projects. So past energy transitions in Wales have been extractive of resources and profits, and I'm mindful that we're delivering this virtual event at the Festival Debate, which is based in South Yorkshire, and so a lot of the coal mining legacy that impacts Wales equally is felt across South Yorkshire, with limited long-term economic benefit retained across communities from the former Industrial Revolution. Therefore, our research aimed to kickstart a national and strategic conversation in Wales on how the Welsh Government and communities can work with the private sector to retain greater income from renewable energy generation. Again, while this research was created to examine the status quo in Wales, there are many correlations with the wider UK and particularly coalfields across South Yorkshire. The recommendations and policy implications of this research could be taken forwards by not only the Welsh Government, but also the UK Government, and implemented across England for a fairer energy system. And we hope this will provide some interesting learning of what can be achieved. Next slide, please, Chiwe. And so a little bit on the Welsh context then, for those that are new to ideas around Wales and governance and devolution. So since 1999, Wales has had its own national parliament, the Senedd, and government. Devolution has been an ongoing process whereby the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, has gradually gained more and more powers and now has full control over things like public services, including health, education, and local government. However, Wales has fewer devolved powers than Scotland and Northern Ireland. And on energy generation specifically, the Senedd has limited powers which impact how Wales controls energy generation and its transition to net zero. This includes planning applications for wind energy generating projects on land in Wales, which have an installed generating capacity of 10 megawatts or more. There is no upper limit anymore, are currently made directly to the Welsh ministers under the Development of National Significance process. Energy generating projects on land other than wind over 350 megawatts are then consented by the UK Secretary of State under the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects process. And the Welsh Government, as stated before, does have weak fiscal powers. So this affects really energy generation, including a limited budget and limited borrowing powers that really impact Welsh Government's ability to invest in energy generation. Therefore, the need for the private sector is really quite great. And furthermore, the Crown, the royal family, actually owns around 65% of the Welsh foreshore and riverbed, and more than 50,000 acres of land across Wales. The value of the Crown estate recently jumped from 96.8 million to 603 million, reflecting the value of the land for renewable energy developments and other projects. And like in Scotland, the Crown Estate is not devolved in Wales, meaning the economic benefits and use of such land are not felt in Wales, which really limits the progress of Wales's economy. And this is particularly relevant given the amount of floating offshore wind projects that are in the pipeline to be delivered on the shoreline of Wales and out to the Celtic Sea, which has been estimated to be a multi-billion-pound industry. So without the devolution of the Crown Estate to Wales, Wales will miss out on a large amount of this economic impact. So that's just a bit on how Wales is slightly different. And if I could get the next slide then, thanks, Chiwe. So then just a bit on the context of the research and our report that we're sort of explaining through today. It sits within, I'd argue, wider discussions that are not only taking place in Wales, but across the UK really, on how can we retain a greater share of the incomes produced from our natural resources. So due to the privatisation of the UK energy system, the majority of renewable energy generation in Wales and the UK is privately owned. A significant proportion of the incomes generated here flow elsewhere and benefit other governments via their own publicly owned energy companies that operate in Wales and in the UK. So as the full nationalisation of energy in the UK or in Wales remains an unlikely option, what other levers can we look at to retain incomes from commercial energy developments? We cannot currently decarbonise the Welsh energy sector without working with the private renewable sector. And this is the same across the UK. So, however, we can aim to contribute to this wider discussion and explore how the Welsh Government, and indeed the UK Government, can set the terms of exchange with the private sector and industry and work together to ensure that Wales's energy sector, along with the wider UK energy sector, is decarbonised while also retaining greater economic and social benefits within communities. And we argue that Wales and the UK must utilise the nation's natural resources, but do so on its own terms. So if we can quickly change slides, thanks, Chiwe. Here I've just got pictures of Ffordd open cast mine. So we have two images. This is the UK's largest open cast mine that operates in Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, a place of large former industrial impacts, but ongoing impacts. It appears that the site was renewed and has been mined up until last year, with the commitment that ongoing mining will lead to funds to be raised to restore the land back to a safe state. However, recently it seems that the land will not be restored to a safe level, and there is an ongoing dispute with whether this will occur and how this will occur and who will pay the brunt of this. And this is part of a wider legacy of open cast reclamation problems across the UK. And from Wales to South Yorkshire, the collapse of industry and subsequent strikes and the oppression of workers, even at the Battle of Orgreave, show that we must not repeat the mistakes of the past, and the harm felt in communities across Wales and across South Yorkshire is really why we need to get the next energy transition to be different and to be just fundamentally. And if we can just change the slide then. Sorry, can we go back 2 slides, apologies, to community benefit funds and social justice? Thank you. So how can renewable energy then link to wider arguments of social justice and fairness? So in the research, we really highlight the role of community benefit funds. And community benefit funds are particularly common within the onshore wind sector. And it's become common for developers to make voluntary annual payments to the communities near and around wind developments, the communities that host that infrastructure, and these are called community benefit funds. They're an annual fund of around 5,000 that is calculated 5,000 per megawatt of installed energy. So different wind farms, for example, will have different levels, and they're also in place on some solar developments. But they're the sort of main economic impact to local communities. So the economic redistribution of profits from renewable developments to host communities can be viewed as a form of redistributive economics and justice. And we examine the considerations of social justice within the wider context of the former coalfield communities in Wales and across the UK. So wealth redistribution is particularly important where renewable energy infrastructure is located in economically disadvantaged and less resilient communities, particularly former coalfield communities across Wales. And research actually shows that the development of onshore renewable infrastructure is not evenly spread across Wales and largely operates in places that are already adversely affected by the fossil fuel industry. This generally is because in areas that have seen a large amount of sort of infrastructure from fossil fuel industry actually already have existing grid connections. So it tends to be that they're easier places to develop renewable energy projects. But we also see that due to this, feelings of unfairness tend to spread. So the Coalfields Regeneration Trust finds that of the proposed developments of national significant projects in Wales, 54% of wind farm proposals and 44% of solar farm proposals are located within the heart of the South Wales Valleys, one of the most deprived areas in the UK. And this is because these previously industrialised areas do have, as I said, better grid infrastructure, capacity and access roads. However, this does tend to lead to the belief that some disadvantaged communities must host infrastructure, while areas more highly valued for their natural beauty, perhaps, and often more affluent areas feel protected, and therefore feelings of unfairness can endure. And furthermore, research then from 2021 by the economist Calvin Jones found that residents in former mining communities in the UK, not just Wales, were highly politically disengaged. They experience low level of trust and political efficacy and are more sceptical towards climate change when compared to their socio-economic counterparts elsewhere. So we feel that actually there is something going on in former coalfield communities, and this can't just be dismissed as opposition or climate change denial. And generally there is a feeling that too much infrastructure has possibly been developed. So to tackle this, I think the ideas of retaining economic benefit and redistributive justice are really core if this is where a lot of development will be taking place. And with the development of renewable projects often taking place near disadvantaged communities, there's a risk that people might observe change in local landscapes, but with little to no direct benefit to their community, while they actually continue to live with the cost of living crisis, but extreme fuel poverty, actually. And so really, we feel where their communities living in fuel poverty next to large-scale renewable energy projects, this is a question of justice and of how can these communities impact and you know, sort of benefit from these projects and alleviate fuel poverty. So there is a need to acknowledge that such political and social attitudes exist in former coalfield communities in Wales and the UK, and may actually underpin negative perceptions of renewables developments and lead to local concern. Therefore, rather than dismiss these concerns, we argue in our paper that this scepticism increases the need for redistributive methods to have a genuine impact and restore trust and enable engagement with the climate transition, and should primarily be perceived as a key aspect of the just transition and a way to build local economic resilience. And then if we can go ahead to slides, thanks, Stewie. Fab, thank you. So then exploring models of energy ownership in Wales. So given this, what Welsh Government policies help to retain greater income within Wales? And how might this policy learning impact the rest of the UK? So the Welsh Government has set targets for local, shared and community energy. So such policy objectives are welcome, but we find that they currently have a limited impact. To an extent, these policies are a recognition that the private renewables industry has not delivered enough local benefit to communities across Wales. So we find that the broad definition of local ownership is limited with no specification of proximity to projects and can be open to exploitation. Local ownership broadly allows local people to invest in projects. They can pay for shares in projects. And there are a number of barriers that really impact this policy in Wales. One being a lot of communities live in poverty and they don't have the financial means to be able to invest in projects. And furthermore, there is no real analysis of proximity. So local owners indeed could be people outside of Wales. And so then we question how local these owners that invest shares in projects really are. So it's a great first step, but could go further. And then shared ownership is essentially where it sort of builds from local ownership. Shared ownership is a really innovative policy that could have real impact in Wales. This would allow developers, large-scale commercial developers, to have shared ownership with local authorities that could invest and have shared ownership, or even community energy projects. So the ownership of energy projects is shared between 2 or more entities. This is currently, however, not mandated, but is just advised in Wales. And in our research with members of the community energy sector, we heard through interviews that while some developers have really engaged well and delivered joint ownership projects working with community energy projects, other leading renewable energy developers have not, and potentially avoid offering shared ownership alongside community energy leaders. So this really limits the impact of this policy. And there's real work to try and encourage developers to really take this on. This policy could really deliver if you did shared ownership with large-scale renewable energy projects alongside community energy projects. You could keep an element of ownership at the local level and a retention of that profit at the local level. So there clearly are limitations to the degree to which these policies currently retain economic impact in communities, although they are a great start and a step in the right direction. But moving beyond this then, the Welsh Government recently established Ynni Cymru, which I'm hoping Grant can speak a little bit more to later on. But Ynni Cymru is a publicly owned energy company to further community-owned projects across Wales. And then slightly different, Trydan Gwyrdd Cymru is again a publicly owned renewable energy developer established by the Welsh Government. However, this is focused on state-owned commercial projects, so less so community-owned projects. And so these are just being established, but really they show that Wales is really leading the way on acknowledging that, you know, the private sector maybe hasn't delivered enough benefit, and what could state ownership of projects deliver, and how could they deliver more? So we currently do not know the extent to which how much Welsh Government will own generation on perhaps the Welsh public estate of land, if they'll play a role in enabling and directing developers potentially to deliver jointly or co-owned projects. So we await further information. Trydan Gwyrdd Cymru, it will not be responsible for all renewable energy generation and development across Wales. And so Wales will rely still on a large level of commercial renewable energy development. Therefore, while these policies are novel and are really useful and a step in the right direction, what other policy reforms can also help communities in Wales be impacted by the profits from renewable energy generation? If we could just change the slide then, thanks, Chewie. So this brings on to community benefit funds. As I stated before, a community benefit fund is a voluntary commitment by the renewable energy developer to pay into a fund, which is then made available to finance community projects. And so this generally seems to be around 5,000 per megawatt of installed capacity. So if you had a 10 megawatt capacity wind farm on 5,000 per megawatt, the community benefit fund annually would be, for example, £50,000 annually into that local community. And Renewable UK Cymru, who are the trade body for the renewable sector representing Wales, found that the onshore wind sector in Wales currently delivers 6.5 million annually to local communities through Community Benefit Fund. And with proposed projects set to increase, this funding could grow to nearly 20 million annually in coming years, just on the basis of how community benefit funds are being calculated as they are now. But in Wales, we find that actually Welsh Government policy relating to Community Benefit Fund is quite weak. It essentially defers to the trade body, Renewable UK Cymru, and we feel that there's a lot of policy reform that the Welsh Government could bring into place to really strengthen the role and impact that community benefit funds could have. And there's a lot of policy learning actually from Scottish Government here on how we could really take community benefit funds and deliver them in a much more impactful way. So then we explore why provide community benefit funds at all, and what is the reason behind providing community benefit funds. And so they can be goodwill by developers and a way to just give back to the local community. Indeed, this is generally how they did develop. They were never mandated. Essentially, developers decided to give back amounts. They can also be a result of community demand, where the community believes they should share an element of profits. This is quite unusual and isn't that commonplace, but did happen in some states in America. Communities got together and negotiated community benefit funds with developers. Or they can be statutory conditions or implemented through policy, where developers are required to give community benefit funds, and this has taken place in the UK. A number of local authorities, including in Wales, Neath Port Talbot, have set up their own policy to guide community benefit fund payments. And indeed, in Scotland, local authorities also set a policy to not only negotiate higher levels of community benefit fund, to also influence how the money was spent. But generally, there's no sort of agreement of sort of, you know, why the provision occurs. And they can also be defined as a contribution to the local community. They can be defined as a way to ease local acceptance and ease opposition to projects. They can be perceived as a way to compensate for impact for projects, although this isn't very well liked by the industry themselves, because it can encourage negative perceptions to renewable energy developments. But what we really think that they can be useful for and should be defined as is a way to redistribute profits back to communities without sort of clear understanding of why to provide community benefit funds. The things they're then used for can really differ. So if we think of community benefit funds as just a contribution, just a donation, then they can be used for anything really, but they're heavily based on the proximity. So if they're linked to impact and the local community, the funds will then only generally be used within a certain proximity to projects. However, if we understand community benefit funds as a redistribution of profits back to communities, then there's an idea that they could be used perhaps in a more wider geographic area, but also the things they can be used for can differ. And so how community benefit funds are defined impacts how they're used. And we would argue that community benefit funds should be seen as a redistribution of profits as part of the just transition. And if we could change the slide then, thanks, Chiwe. Thank you. So what is the economic impact of community benefit funds? So given that, unlike past energy transitions of coal mining, employment opportunities on renewable energy projects are focused to the construction. And once projects are constructed, wind farm, for example, may only need 5 to 6 wind farm technicians to keep them running. So the employment opportunities for things like wind farms are slightly different to mining. So therefore, the actual use of a community benefit fund, they're identified as the main source of long-term local benefit for communities from onshore wind farms, and they have a potential to secure positive economic impacts within local areas. But generally, little is known of their economic impact within Wales. And the key reason here is that currently there is no mechanism established in Wales by the Welsh Government to capture the rate of private sector investment into Welsh communities via community benefit funds. So we here call for a community benefit funds register to actually understand how much is coming into communities. Is there a level playing field? Are communities getting the same amounts from developers? Or do we see, as the research has shown, these levels of community benefit fund actually do differ? So without retaining this data and without understanding how much investment is coming into Wales, we can't really understand or analyse the average rates of community benefit fund provision, or really have an understanding of what the money is being used for. Renewable UK, the trade body, recommend a community benefit fund rate of, as I said before, 5,000 per megawatt of installed capacity for onshore wind. There is currently no policy relating to solar development. So we really see within solar energy, often there is no community benefit fund at all, or sometimes these rates really diverge quite significantly, which really is quite impactful if we think that community benefit funds are the main long-term economic impact. And so in our research, we engaged with developers and we found that, and we also, did engagement with local authorities across Wales to really try and understand how much community benefit fund is coming into Wales. And we used freedom of information requests to try and gather some of this information. And our research found that community benefit fund rates offered have fluctuated greatly across Wales. Sometimes they actually exceed £5,000 and they go slightly above, but often they actually fall below the recommended rate. And again, the recommended rate is only a recommendation, it isn't mandated. So while developers are recommended to sort of stick to 5,000, in our research, we actually found developers dropping far below 5,000, but we also found evidence of projects, quite large-scale onshore renewable projects, going through planning with no commitment to a community benefit fund whatsoever. And this is really impactful. Again, you know, community benefit funds have the potential to be the long-term economic impact from projects to communities, but without clear, strict set policy from Welsh Government here, we are finding that some developers are not given a community benefit fund, and some are actually falling way below 5,000. And so ultimately we find that the power to set community benefit fund levels still remains with the developer, with communities having little to no power to affect the levels and rates of community benefit funds they're offered, or even if they're offered one at all. And so really, evidently from our research, we find that community benefit fund provision can vary across communities in Wales. So despite this, where community benefit funds are being delivered at 5,000 or above, they allow for communities hosting onshore wind farms to capture private sector investment in the form of long-term financial payments. And as the rate of community benefit funding guidance has gradually increased alongside the scale of onshore developments, we think this is really, really important because in the coming years, it's likely that communities in Wales could receive quite substantial funds if guidance was followed. So the pipeline of projects that could be delivered to Wales, and particularly sort of floating offshore projects, these are going to be quite large scale. And given that community benefit funds are assessed on a megawatt sort of calculation, the larger the project, the larger the community benefit fund. If the Welsh Government really set quite leading policy here on mandating developers to have to give a set level of community benefit fund, and also increasing it from around 5,000, because we actually found that the rate has been at 5,000 for over 10 years now and hasn't really increased. But there is a key role for Welsh Government here to really lead the way, to set their own community benefit fund policy and learn from countries like Scotland that have really useful toolkits for communities. With the pipeline of projects, quite large scale projects coming into Wales, even if we just secured community benefit funds from there, then there could be quite a large scale private sector investment coming directly into communities at a time where local authorities and communities, you know, are facing real economic challenges with the backdrop of the ongoing cost of living crisis. But there are barriers that sort of limit impact. So generally the activities that funds have been used for do not currently allow for economic development of the local community, and have commonly involved things such as improving community buildings with painting churches and community halls, or funding small social groups and sponsoring sports kits. So to conduct this research, we engage quite widely with communities and also renewable energy developers that are delivering these projects. And we found that generally the funds, even when they are there in quite substantial levels, the things the funds are being used for, the activities, don't really allow for long-term development and economic impact. And so there's a key role for, again, Welsh Government and policy to really highlight to developers and communities some forward-thinking ideas of how community benefit funds could be used. And we see that this is happening in some examples across Wales, for example, where particularly in the community energy sector, and some examples in the commercial sector, renewable community benefit funds are being used for electric vehicle car fleets in areas where communities maybe don't actually have access to cars because they live in poverty. You know, I think 1 in 5 families in Wales don't have access to a car. So things like rural electric vehicle car fleets could be really impactful. And so really moving away from the current provision and use of community benefit funds of painting churches and actually towards quite forward thinking and impactful ideas could be a real way that we could affect change in Wales. But we also identified through engagement with communities themselves barriers that impact local residents from engaging with funds. So once funds are set up, their communities can engage with them and sort of apply to funds to use them. However, the key barriers we found was generally there was quite a lack of information about community benefit funds and how to apply, and concern regarding time, capacity and confidence and skills required to complete the forms. You know, a lot of these community benefit funds are operating in places of real economic disadvantage. So if you're someone that's trying to feed your kids and work 2 jobs, the odds are you haven't got the time to be feeding into these community benefit funds. And also you just might lack the skills required to actually fill in these forms that can be quite complex. And one respondent who had applied to a community benefit fund noted that they found the experience really tedious, bureaucratic, and lacked the required support with the application. So there could be clear work to sort of facilitate more support for communities and how they can get involved in these funds. So as we said, not all members in community within an area have adequate or equal capacity or time to feed into these funds. And what we feel does often occur and what we see from researchers, funds can become shaped by the loudest voices in an area, or maybe by those most resourced to influence funds, meaning there are limits to the levels of engagement within communities. And this can freeze out the most marginalised individuals within communities from accessing funding. So one idea that could counter this would be the idea of top slicing and pooling community benefit funds, where they could be used to sort of in a more democratic way, be used to facilitate projects over a large area that might be targeted to communities in poverty, for example, and more marginalised members within communities. And then if I could change the slide, thanks, Chiwe. Fab. So broadly on community benefit funds, we did identify that there was a lot of policy learning from Scotland, and the Scottish Government have actually set up not only a community benefit funds register, but also a map. Communities can log on to this and find out where in their community and where across Scotland actually funds are that they can apply to and get involved with. But also it highlights ideas of how funds can be used to actually facilitate economic development in communities. And there's also free support and advice for both communities and developers to negotiate community benefit funds in a more impactful way. So there's quite a lot of learning that our research points to Scotland actually, and how Welsh Government, if they learnt from this, could really lead the way with leading community benefit fund policies. But we currently sort of found that the way that community benefit funds are used with a sort of annual funding stream means that they kind of really build reliance in communities. So once projects are up, say 25 years, once that wind farm is no more, what happens to that community? Because if they've become really reliant on this annual fund to paint the church, to fund a local school sports hall, for example, once those projects go, what is the legacy? And that's one of our key concerns, really. Community benefit funds should be building resilience, and we have fears that they arguably breed reliance. So really, they need to bring lasting economic impact so that when projects are decommissioned, there is that lasting impact that we can see the project has had, and communities aren't sort of left in the dark then, lacking that annual fund. So then, beyond community benefit funds, what else can we do to retain wealth for communities? And what are the international case studies that are out there? So in actually doing this research, it was quite difficult because when researching what other states do to retain income, you find that actually the UK is an outlier. The top 10 countries on renewable energy generation, of 9 of them all have one thing in common, and that's that they have state ownership of energy. Energy wasn't privatized. So the UK is an outlier in the fact that, you know, we do have a privatized energy system. So really I have to look at countries that also had either a semi-public private energy sector or a completely private energy sector. And so here we have the examples of Canada and Denmark. And so in terms of understanding beyond community benefit funds, then how can we retain the most impact within communities? Our research took us to community and shared energy ownership, basically. So community ownership of energy can deliver increased autonomy, empowerment, and resilience by providing a long-term income for local control over finances, often in areas where there are few options for generating wealth. So this is something that both Grant and Dan can speak to, but essentially community projects are owned wholly or in part by a local community. And they provide a sort of more a way to develop sort of those local circular economies where projects can build renewable energy, but the profits then can be retained and invested in sort of a range of activities. And really, in terms of sort of having maximized local impact and local economic impact, shared ownership, where you have a private renewable energy project alongside a community project, would really help to sort of rebuild the energy sector across Wales and the UK, where not only money is being given back to communities, but actually an element of ownership is held at the community level. And again, going back to sort of the energy transition of coal mining across South Yorkshire and Wales, ownership was something that we did not have in our communities. And so I think in conversations of a just transition and how we reimagine an energy future, I think building in that understanding that community energy and shared ownership can actually not just deliver local economic impact, but ownership at the community level, which is something that a lot of our communities have never experienced before. And one area where we sort of really had a key amount of learning from was Canada. So community ownership of renewable energy developments are emerging as a potential pathway to reconciliation and a just transition with indigenous communities in Canada. Given the financial barriers, a number of ownership arrangements actually exist with varying levels of ownership from full to part and various levels of financial risk with access to finance and arrangements. And importantly, commercial developers provide free support and expertise guidance to limit barriers for indigenous ownership. And Canada has now become a world leader in community ownership, despite having a semi-public private energy sector. While the political and cultural context of Canada differs with the indigenous communities and the land back movement, it actually offers real insights into enhanced community ownership. And so I can speak to this later if anyone wants me to, but there are 4 levels of ownership, of indigenous ownership in Canada. And actually that could be a real key aim of sort of policy learning for Wales and the wider UK, really, on how can we facilitate not any communities, but particularly marginalised communities that might lack the financial resources to own projects. How can we support them in co-owning these commercial projects and build more of a community-led energy sector? And so then if I can come on to the next slide, thanks, Chiwe. Our recommendations then, we also drew from Denmark. So in Denmark, the Danish government imposed a novel statutory policy to compel renewable energy developers to establish a co-ownership model. And this ensured that new onshore and nearshore wind farms must have at least 20% of the projects owned by local communities within a 5-kilometre radius of projects. And here in Denmark, community energy really drives their energy transition. So Canada and Denmark really were key countries with sort of semi-private public ownership of energy that really show how we can change the energy system and allow for increased community ownership of energy. And so our recommendations then were to repower communities and reform community benefit fund. So we in order to sort of regain greater economic impact and income from renewable energy projects within communities, we argue the Welsh Government should introduce a whole swathe of sort of community benefit fund policy reforms that would support both developers and community to achieve greater impacts from community benefit funds. Then we'd urge the Welsh Government to establish like best practice through Trydan Gwyrdd Cymru and Ynni Cymru, but particularly Trydan Gwyrdd Cymru, the state-owned energy developer. We'd urge the Welsh Government to ensure, following the Danish example, a minimum of 30% of community ownership on their future developments to maximise retained income and economic impact for communities. And particularly the idea of that proximity radius would be really interesting. And then we'd argue that we need to accelerate community ownership on commercial projects and compel new commercial renewable projects above 5 megawatts to have a minimum level of 15% of community and local ownership. And this again is sort of inspired by Denmark. And then our last sort of recommendation was the idea that how do we finance net zero? Welsh Government has a number of financial limitations with weak borrowing powers, and the wider UK economy as well. We really find that one way that we could finance net zero would be to establish a sovereign wealth fund for Wales. This was something that was done by Norway, where they retained an element of offshore oil revenues. This was done years ago, and reinvest them for sort of future generations. And learning from the sort of Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund, we'd argue that Wales could establish their own. And indeed, there are discussions that at the wider UK level with UK Labour, sort of ideas of establishing a similar wealth fund, where an element of net revenues, at least sort of 15% of net revenues from large-scale projects, would be reinvested into a Wales Wealth Fund. And this fund would then be used to facilitate sort of community projects and investment in communities to retain that sort of economic impact. So I hope that's been useful as a bit of an outline of sort of our research. And now I'm just going to bring in Dan McCallum. So I think Dan's just going to speak to his experience of actually delivering community energy projects, and I guess how they differ then from large-scale community projects, and what are the wider sort of benefits that community projects can bring. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Lydia. Hopefully I'm off mute now. Okay, I'll just whiz through my presentation. So I work for a charity, Our Lam and Tower in South Wales. And this was our original sort of idea, really, just a community and wind farm bid back in 1998, and the way that the press sort of picked that up as an interesting idea. And it was at the same sort of like time as communities in Scotland were also developing community schemes. Next slide. And then this was us getting turned down for planning, actually. And it's quite unusual to have that number of people actually supporting a wind farm planning application to the local authority. But unfortunately, it made no difference and they still turned it down. Lots of reasons why. But it's amazing what sort of bureaucrats can do to a community scheme. Next slide. So this is how we help fund our, sort of next sort of 10 years of struggle. We kind of sold our bodies, basically, was one of the ways, just to make you laugh, hopefully. So we did a naked calendar. Sold a few that helped pay for, I think, public inquiry, 3 planning applications, a judicial review, 3 common land applications, all of which we lost. Anyway, next slide. This is me, photo taken by my wife. Next slide. And that's finally our wind turbines up on the Gurid. And honestly, whenever I see them, I practically start crying. So I'll try and hold it together now. But these are sort of, I can see them out the window actually, up on the mountain. Yeah, it's kind of a miracle, basically, they got built in the end. But it's not an uncommon story across community energy. And sometimes sort of luck does hold out. And we finally got our schemes turbines commissioned in January 2017. And that sort of led on to a lot of other projects. Next slide, please. And Lydia mentioned that we then went on to set up EGNI co-op, and sort of by contrast, that was actually really quick, mainly probably because planning permission isn't required for rooftop solar. So I think that's the key lesson that I've learned: just stay away from planners because they're absolutely useless. So we established lots of rooftop solar across South Wales on schools, community buildings, and businesses. And this is the panels on the Geraint Thomas velodrome in Newport. And that relationship with Newport Council was absolutely critical, and kind of has enabled us to develop more relationships with other local authorities. Next slide. And that's our sort of legal structure. The charity Owl and Tower, we've set up 2 co-ops, Owl, which is the wind farm, and EGNI, rooftop solar, and then other projects that are in development, sort of managed by the charity, Hubagors, which I'll come on to, a community transport scheme, and also an education program. Next slide. And this is the Hubagors, the former primary school. And it is quite interesting when we talk to other communities, especially on sort of shared ownership projects that Lydia mentioned, that when we say that we were able to use revenue from our wind farm to buy the old school, that kind of does interest people, because that's such a common story across villages in South Wales, that the local authority is closing village schools. They usually get knocked down and redeveloped for housing. So it's quite transformative that we were able to buy ours. Next slide. It was a hell of a lot of work, though. We basically had to completely gut the building. This gives a sense of it. Next slide. And this is the ground source heat pump that we've now installed in the building. And you can see it starting to sort of take shape behind. Yeah, next slide. We put cork external wall insulation and then lime render, because we're interested to sort of look at low carbon methods for redeveloping, an old stone building. So it's been quite an interesting process, a building process that we need to write up at some point. Next slide. And one bit we managed to preserve away from the dry rot was the old fireplaces. We kind of restored them, and they are really beautiful. Next slide. Again, and we've sort of got full disabled access, so a hoist in the toilet. I can't remember the name for it, but it's a special kind of toilet area which allows disabled people kind of full access, basically. And there aren't many of them. There's only a couple in our area, and they're in Tesco's, which kind of offers limited scope for enjoyment, really. Next slide. And we've engaged the community in redeveloping the project, the school. This is a heritage quilt that we've done, and which is going to be displayed in or hung from the ceiling, actually, in the cafe. Next slide. And that's one of the sort of panels that one of the local people made, which is a picture of the school. One of the tenants in the school, of course, is the guild of the spinners, weavers, and dyers, who sound like some sort of community mafia group, but actually they're a very engaged group of textile workers that sort of share big looms to make textiles. Really good. Next slide, please. We also done a stained glass project. We uncovered 67 windows at a high level within the school, and we then worked with a stained glass artist and local members of the community to make loads and loads of panels. So he came up with a sort of concept design for the panels, looking at local themes, and then those have been installed throughout the building. Next slide. That's one of the panels, and you can see then the windows that they're now all fitted into. Next slide. And these are concrete, not concrete, tiles which should display different local nature themes made by local people as well, which again are going to be going on the wall in Hubagors. Next slide. Gardening group, which is already meeting at the site. Next slide. And kind of now how currently it looks, believe it or not, the planners have got involved actually in our project. We have got planning for the whole thing, but they've made us apply for planning now to do the sustainable drainage scheme to the rear. And it's a bit nuts because it's basically a sort of tarmac playground. So anything that we do, like just digging a hole, is going to improve drainage and sustainable drainage. But anyway, we just can't seem to avoid the planners at all stages, even though we do try our best to. So anyway, we're in the middle of applying for planning permission for that at the moment. But anyway, you're very welcome to visit the centre when we hope to open in the autumn. And hopefully this is just an example of what communities can achieve when they've got an asset base behind them. Next slide. Okay, so come and visit. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Oh, diolch, Dan. That was really, really interesting. And I've already got a few questions to ask myself, particularly sort of that social impact as well that projects can have. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now, Grant, if you'd like to present your talk or presentation.
Sure, let me see whether I'm sharing right. It looks
Yeah,
good. It looks good for me. Working for you. Great. Thanks so much. Thank you for the invite, Lydia, to come and talk alongside you today. And thanks to the Festival of Debates for holding this as well. I won't talk for very long, but I want you to remember this picture that's shown in the background here of Shop Griffiths and Pennagroyce as one of the projects we've been associated with and are really pleased to be partners with as we work along. I'll see whether I have the same column as Dan in terms of, oh, there you go, and my one moved. So I just want to let you know, this is me and some of my experience, really. One of the questions I was asked is, why did I get involved in community energy? Well, there's a link between all these. Although many of them are energy-based, there is a social link here, a community link to all of them. It's about how we retain our benefits locally, how we make the most of our local economy as well. So you have, for example, datblygiad egni gwledig, the tongue twister that Lydia tried to pronounce earlier. I've had many years practice, Lydia. It helps. But the fun bit for those of you who don't speak Welsh for datblygiad egni gwledig is that deg itself is a bit of a play on words for me, as you might hear from my accent, not originally from North Wales. It can also be the word for fairness in Welsh. And fairness is very important, hence it's then used in the name Ynni, which is an organisation that owns a wind turbine in Carmarthenshire in South Wales that I'm a part of. And you'll also notice there that we highlight the ni in Ynni. So Ynni means energy, teg meaning fair energy. But by highlighting the ni, that includes the us in it as well. So it highlights the point about it being more than one. And you'll notice that same trick then gets played in Ynni Newydd and Ynni Llŷn as well. And I first started with a social enterprise starting up called the Anglesey and Gwynedd Recovery Organisation, which was actually to help people with drug and alcohol problems to help themselves as a community interest company. Some 12 years ago or thereabouts, before moving into energy. And you can see right in the middle, close to my heart, Menta Tin Llan, which is our local pub we bought a couple of years ago, and are presently just beginning a little over £2 million renovation of the pub, which is going to be very exciting for us. So DEG, and that's who I'm here on behalf of today. That's datblygiad egni gwledig. Although I wear many hats, it's DEG that's sponsoring me to be here today, if you like. And DEG is a social enterprise based in Carnarvon in northwest Wales. We work with communities in the area, mostly on energy projects, but also on climate change projects. Really based around how communities can work together. So how people within communities can come together to work together cooperatively to create benefit for everybody, but also how communities can then come together and work together for benefit for everybody as well. And we've worked with lots of communities, not just in Northwest Wales, as this image shows. We tend to get asked to head over to the east of Wales as well, all the way over to Wrexham, etc. But predominantly we work in Northwest Wales, in Gwynedd, working on many projects, some which I share with you as we go through. But the question about why community energy, well, there's some of these examples here that come up. But for me, it was about the way that community energy really taps into what's at the core of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act in Wales, about sustainable development principles, about how community energy has benefits, not just about the economy and the environment, but also about communities, about social benefits. And for us in the northwest of Wales, real cultural and linguistic benefits as well that come in. And community energy is a way of bringing all those things together. When you bring people together to talk about energy, to bring money in, just the people coming together and developing a project like an energy project brings with it a sense of confidence and empowerment within our communities as well. And all that really grabbed my attention, and I've been trying to make that happen for the past 10 or 11 years. And I want to just sort of cover quickly, broadly, for people who aren't aware, and I know that these figures come from 2021, but you're talking about 58,000 people being involved across the UK in community energy organisations. That's a big number for us. You know, over 90 organisations just working on low carbon transport, for example. And we know in Wales that there's been an increase of about 6% since 2021, and that just in the last year, that employment numbers increased by nearly 10% just in Wales. And this map gives you a picture of community energy organisations more broadly across the UK as well, not just in Wales. And it also shows you 183 new full-time jobs were created just in 2021 alone across the UK. That it's not just about generation as well, that energy efficiency interventions saved £3.3 million from UK energy bills that year. And about £15 million was spent on boosting local economies from community energy income. So there's a huge range of benefits that we bring. This is just pictures that a little more for us in a Welsh context there. There was 145 full-time jobs when this measurement was done in 2021. I believe there's 160 now, hence the 10% increase I mentioned before. But what about locally? And it's great to see Wallace George is here with us. I had a quick sneak through who were some of our participants earlier, and Wallace works here at Ogwen at the moment. But I just want to paint a picture for you of a local project to me. Ogwen, a hydro scheme, 100 kilowatts, not huge, but fairly big, nearly £500,000 to build. Majority of that money raised locally within Bethesda. Bethesda's not a well-off community. They've suffered in the post-industrial landscape that we live in at the moment. You know, they were a place of slate mining, quarrying previously. Of course, all those jobs you'll recall have gone during the Great Strike and other times. And Bethesda's been a little down on its luck. But along comes Ogwen and is able to raise only £500,000 from local people putting their money in so they could build this hydro scheme. And the hydro scheme can then provide money back into the community, do a range of things like Lydia has been talking about, like Dan has just shown us here. You know, they thought at the time that it would be about £12,000 a year that they put into a local charity, in the same way as Dan was talking about the wind turbines working in South Wales. But of course, energy prices have increased. That means there's more money that's able to invest it back in. And that's really interesting for us to think about, that a local community organisation will increase the amount of community benefit they put in when there's a windfall because electricity prices rise. But that £5,000 per megawatt that Lydia was talking about before, that's been the same since 2011, 2012. It's not changed at all in all that time, despite increases in energy incomes. And Ogwen's then been able to do all sorts of fantastic things. So they work in partnership with a local community development company called Partneriaeth Ogwen, and they've just bought them some new buses. You can see here electric bus that's being used for the local school, for example, to help them reduce their carbon emissions, but also to be able to do much more around the local community. And you'll also spot on the top, that's the local rugby club with all the solar panels on top that Ogwen have put in there as well, helping the rugby club to become more sustainable, not just environmentally, but also economically, because they can would sell the electricity produced from those solar panels at a reduced rate to the rugby club for use there, so that there's some security for them, both for Ogwen in terms of having an income from the rugby club, but also, perhaps more importantly, for the rugby club knowing that they have this cheaper electricity for them into the future. And these kinds of projects come in all sorts of scales. Dan's got those fantastic 2 big wind turbines down there and solar panels on buildings all over Wales, which is amazing in its size. But there's little projects like Shop Push Glass in Denbighshire, not far from Ruthin, a community-owned shop set up in the village hall at Push Glass. We worked with them some years ago to put those solar panels on the roof there. And those solar panels not only reduced the electricity cost for the community-owned shop to run by half, it also brought in enough income for them to be able to pay their rent each month. So they're far more economically sustainable in the community shop there. But also they come in big sizes as well. So I'm involved in Newydd, which if we can build out all 30 megawatts of the project, would be the largest community solar project in the UK. Although that figure's changing all the time, and there may be a larger one coming somewhere in the UK. We're thinking that there we can produce enough electricity for 8,500 homes. We now have full planning permission. This project goes across the border from Wales into England, about half and half. We've got a huge grid problem there that I could talk to you about for far too long. That I have. So we might have to start small and build it up. But what we hope to be able to do is provide that electricity for local use. And I think that's really where the future of community energy lies. And how can we use the electricity we're producing locally to help local people to reduce the costs on their bills? And there's many opportunities for us in the community energy sector as we diversify and innovate. So I've just said, perhaps there's a way of local supply, which you can see on the slide here about halfway down. But it's not just about electricity generation, and that's what I wanted to share with this slide. It can be about efficiency, it can be about energy storage, it's about low carbon transport, as you've seen and heard from Lydia as well. It's about how do we affect a reduction in the use of electricity, demand-side management, and also looking towards heat as well. How do we reduce the costs for heat for people over winter? So that's a quick run through for you of some of the projects that I've been involved with, trying to build a broader picture around community energy and some of the benefits that are involved there. But I think the real value for us today is going to be in the conversations we can have now and answering some of the questions that come through. So I'm looking forward to hearing from those. Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grant. And I'm definitely going to ask about Ogwen, because I think that's a really interesting, that trade-in of local energy is the future, in my opinion. I guess there's a question in the chat of quite a simple one, but I don't think it is that simple, actually. What would you say the fundamental difference is between community energy and private energy projects? And I wonder if Dan, because I think this was something I was really struck by, but it's not that obvious. The levels of profits being generated, but how much actually are going back to communities. So if you could answer the difference between community and private projects, but particularly, Dan, I wonder if you could give a bit of an insight into, community benefit funds, even when they are, 1.8 million annually, they actually only reflect around 1 to 3% of profits of annual net revenue. So really, they aren't a return of profit. So how then, I guess, does community projects, where do the profits from community projects and generation go? And I guess, would you say that's a key difference?
Yeah, I think sort of Grant mentioned it. If a community energy scheme makes more in any one year because of high electricity prices, which all the schemes have, like in the last 2 or 3 years, so our own income from our wind farm has pretty much doubled this year, from £1 to £2 million. So it's a massive increase. So goodness knows what profits, British Gas, Scottish Power are making, because they're able to trade on kind of spot markets. So yeah, it's really the increased revenue basically goes into further community projects. But I think the key thing for me is basically the values that underpin it. So, you know, you've got to have sort of faith, I guess, in the sort of not-for-profit legal structures that exist. So things like charities and co-ops, you know, if they don't do what they say they're going to do according to their objects, they're in big trouble. And okay, it does happen, but it's pretty rare. And I think there's lots of examples of really good community energy schemes now that can sort of demonstrate what the benefits are. And you're right, the proportion of income that can come back to the community is just far, far greater through a community-owned scheme. Yeah, and I think your report kind of highlighted how important it is to kind of make it transparent what the levels of community benefit are. That's the starting point. Just find out the existing schemes and what, if it's £5,000 per megawatt or 8,000 or less, you know, what these different projects are offering, and then to see what are the ways to increase that. And I think the shared ownership agenda as well, where you've got cooperation between community energy and private developers, is really interesting. We're involved in a number of schemes locally in Neath Talbot. Yeah, I think that side is important to take forward as well.
Yeah, definitely. Grant, did you want to come in on that?
Thanks. There's just a story I want to tell about this, really. One of my favourite ones, which is I spoke about it in Ogwen, and you just go across the mountain and you arrive in Dyffryn Peris, in Llanberis, and there they have Electric Mountain, French-owned, Engie-owned, the pumped hydro scheme, where they pump the water from the lake at the bottom of the mountain up to the dam at the top of the mountain. It's huge. It costs millions and millions and millions to build. It makes something like £1 million an hour or something ridiculous like that, you know. And they drop the water from the top down when everybody gets up to make a cup of tea at the same time every evening to produce the extra electricity that's needed. If you just walk across the valley from the lake, you go up the other side, there's a little 50 kilowatt hydro scheme owned by Uni Padan Peris, the local community energy organisation. And let's compare the two. So it costs tens of millions, silly money, to build the pumped hydro scheme. It cost about £250,000 to build the hydro scheme on the other side. Still a lot of money for a community, don't get me wrong. Engie and Electric Mountain, the Norwig pumped hydro scheme, they provide a community fund of £10,000 a year. Any Padam Peris over here, they also provide a community benefit fund, £10,000 a year. So if it's possible for a community energy project of that scale to provide the same community benefit of the huge scale of Norway, it gives you an indication of where we're missing out by allowing our local natural resources to be used by multinational organisations and those based elsewhere to create profit. And we shouldn't be fooled by the kind of patronising down payments that we get coming back as a means to say, oh, aren't you lucky, we're investing. What did you say before? Was it £68 million that renewable?
6.5 annually from all of onshore wind currently.
So, you know, that sounds like a big number, doesn't it? But what they're not telling us is what the bigger number is about the amount of profit that's being made in those organisations as well, and where that's going. And as I think has been suggested elsewhere, you know, how do we recognise that as a percentage of the energy income being made throughout Wales? That might be a better way for us to think about what benefits should be retained locally economically, as opposed to a nominal number of £5,000 or £8,000 per megawatt.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. It's sometimes uncomfortable, isn't it, to have these discussions of profit and really challenge sort of, you know, the status quo. But I think that's how we achieve a just transition, and that should be a question of a just transition of where profits lie, where they're generated. And I think interesting, I should say, in the research we engage with a number of developers, and one question in the questionnaire was, would you welcome stronger policy relating to community benefit funds? And every single developer said yes, they would actually welcome sort of actually policy implementation from Welsh Government, because what they find is when they do deliver the money, and as we've identified, it's not a lot, it's not a big element of their profits, but actually when they deliver the money, they don't really know what to do with the money, and they feel like they haven't got much support in that money being spent more wisely. So I also think there is a role for Welsh Government to connect the community and the private sector where they are delivering, encourage a bit more, but where they are delivering, actually support for that money to be used better. And then if I could just ask a question, Grant, you have a role within Any Cymru, and I'm not sure how much you can say about it, but for the audience, just a reminder, Any Cymru is the state-owned energy developer to facilitate growing these community energy projects across Wales. And I guess from your perspective then, how can or how could Any Cymru help to facilitate greater community ownership of energy across Wales, and where do you see that fitting in with sort of just transition conversations?
Well, presently I could say a little about it. Presently we have the guidance from the Welsh Government's cooperation agreement. So Any Cymru was created due to an agreement between the Welsh Labour government and Plaid Cymru in opposition. And they said that they wanted to try and further community-owned energy projects in Wales with a particular interest in smart local energy systems. And I think that's where we're trying to concentrate efforts at the moment. However, there is a clear concentration for us around the just transition as well. How do we ensure that everybody benefits from the transition towards renewable energy? How to ensure that as many people as possible can take part in the transition, and that people aren't left out, particularly where some of the present approaches may mean those in most need are left out, as you've highlighted quite clearly in your excellent report, Lydia. So Any Cymru at the moment is testing out what's possible and what's not. It's early days for us. There's nothing off the table. We have a range of work streams presently that are pulling together information and data so that we can begin making informed decisions about what the right approaches are to take. Now, I'm not trying to give a political answer. I'm trying to give an honest answer about the position we're in at the moment within Any Cymru, which is very much about saying, okay, where can we put our effort to have the biggest impact for us? And one of the things we're doing at the moment, and I've been trying to type an answer to John Wood in the chat, so save typing, I might say it now. One of the areas we're looking at is around local supply and local markets. How do they work presently? What works? What barriers are in place for them to be able to work? And that it's generally said that you cannot sell locally generated energy to local people. And it's only kind of true. It's not fully true. It's very difficult to do. And if you were to ask Ofgem about the regulations, they would say, well, there are license exempt conditions that allow for this to happen up to a certain size. So what we're doing at the moment is, as I was just explaining more broadly about Any Cymru, is pulling in the information about where is this happening right now? How does that work? Are we able to test that in areas? Are we able to roll that out more broadly for the benefit of people? So we have something, for example, like Energy Local, which again, coming back to Bethesda, the real innovators of community energy in North Wales at Ynni Ogwen and Partneriaeth Ogwen in Bethesda. They have the Energy Local project there, which creates a virtual network, if you like, so that we know how much energy is produced or electricity is produced by a local hydro scheme. We measure that. We then measure the electricity being used by 100 homes in the area. And then we share that electricity virtually. It's not the actual electrons that get moved around, but it's all done on a spreadsheet somewhere in the background. That's one model that can be used. And there's other models that relate to power purchase agreements and what they call sleeving, and many other models that is probably set for another session some other time.
No, thanks, Grant. That's really, really useful. There's a question there's a few questions that we can get to. There's one from Reinhard Huss that I can answer in part, and if the others want to have a think. So essentially, Reinhard asks, should the proposed approach go one step further and overcome the constraints of the current economic model, which ignores our different commons? All privatisation of commons such as land, sun, wind, minerals should be charged with a commons for your tax. This approach should be applied retrospectively for past exploitation of our commons, such as mining. What do you think? So I think this is a really interesting question, actually. There's an element, if anyone wants to read it, the paper, I can share the link, it's a long one, but there's actually a part of the project, the paper where we write about the commons, essentially. And I think Reinhard's question is at the core, or should be at the core of questions on just transition. You find just transition conversations tend to be about skills and employment. And while that is a hugely important area that we need to be concerned on, just looking at Tata Steel and what's happening there, I think just transition has to go beyond just jobs. And so really our project was the idea that, well, we need the private sector to develop energy generation for us right now. We need to tackle the climate crisis. But where the private sector comes in and develops projects, they also access and tap into the commons. So Wales is water, Wales is sun, Wales is wind, for example. And they are owned by us all. You know, no one technically owns them, but they are all of ours. And certainly when they come to communities and use communities' commons, then that's sort of where understandings and considerations of, well, actually, what's the ask and what is the negotiation then? So I think our work tried to encourage the Welsh Government to be bold and to say, you know, you can set the terms of engagement with the private sector a bit more strongly in communities, but also in Wales's favour. I don't think if we act, you know, sort of try to retain greater profits and net revenues from the private sector, they're gonna sort of leave Wales, because we do have great resources like you've mentioned. So it's about working with the private sector, acknowledging that they are going to help us decarbonise and meet net zero, but also that Wales has a lot to offer in those natural commons and the resources. And so what's the ask? What's the return? That you use the resources and provide the energy, but we give the resources then. So I think Reinhard's questions is really at the core of all of this. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on it. Yeah, Grant.
Oh, I was giving a nod to Dan because I thought
We
I'd
got
talked
that.
too much.
No, I think you answered it very well, Lydia.
Okay, fab. No worries, thank you. But yeah, just a great question, and I think those considerations really need to be at the core of how we approach net zero. And then I think there was one question on how our community benefit funds are used, who decides. So this is a really interesting, and there is no one answer to this because it's quite complex and quite messy, and that essentially comes from the fact that there is a lack of Wales level policy to guide community benefit funds. It's really up to developers. There is no sort of guiding policy in Wales, whereas there is in Scotland. So currently, community benefit funds, they're paid in for by the developer, and they often get established, and they can get established as like a community interest company, a KIC, an independent charity. There's different ways they can be set up. But there are a lot of sort of governance and accountability and transparency issues that we identified through sort of engagement. I did hear of one community benefit fund that was in Wales that was run by someone that lived in Cornwall, and it was essentially just an online voting platform, and you could upvote what the money was used for. But we're talking about large amounts of money, so an idea of setting up a fund like that is dreadful, essentially. So there are huge concerns that as these funds actually might get larger, not because of policy changes, but just because projects get larger, we really need to see, and we would really welcome the Welsh Government actually implementing strong guidance that both facilitates communities' engagement in these funds, but also ensures that they're democratic. Some developers are really, you know, of strict procedures, and that tends to be the larger developers that have been doing this for a long time. But where you've got maybe smaller scale, newer developers that are new to funds, we see that, you know, funds aren't being set up in the most impactful way then. But who decides? Essentially, funds will have priorities. Sometimes they'll engage with communities to ask the community what they think the fund's priority should be. Sometimes they won't. they'll just decide the fund's priorities themselves. Some have quite good engagement and understand that fund is the community's to use and decide. But in other experiences, we've found that developers still believe that the fund is theirs to administer where they want. But really, the real approach should be that this fund is the community's to influence and use. So it's a really interesting question, and the report itself explores this in a bit more detail. But essentially, funds are set up with, in the best case scenario, have funding panels where a paneler is appointed to decide how funds should be spent. But again, that isn't normal across the board, really. So there is no one straightforward answer to that. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in.
Yeah, Lydia, I think it's just, as you said in your report, really, it needs to be kind of more transparent as a starting point. You know, we're just being absolute mugs, really, for not sort of tackling this. And this is all of our responsibility, really, in Wales to actually do something. And I'd suggest it's the same in England as well. In Scotland, they have got a pretty transparent register developed by Local Energy Scotland. We should definitely copy and paste it, because then it just puts pressure on developers then to comply, because they can see that other ones are doing the same, what they're offering, and just makes it clearer. And I think you're right, the governance needs to be much better. At the moment, it's completely random. I feel, I don't know what the guidance in Scotland says, but in Wales it kind of makes sense for the local council for voluntary services to be involved, because they represent the kind of voluntary sector, usually in a sort of a local borough area. So where we are, it's Neath Talbot Council for Voluntary Services. So yeah, it just makes sense for them to be managing these funds, because they often do it anyway. But you know, they've got the local knowledge, and the groups are already their members anyway, so they've got the outreach, rather than sort of bringing in some other entity to kind of manage these funds. But we just need to demonstrate, kind of get developers to do that more easily.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Local Energy Scotland there, and the Scottish Government are leading the way in how they support communities to engage with funds. But also you mentioned the register and the map. One barrier is, before you even get to how do communities influence funds, do they even know the funds are there in the first place? And that was one of the barriers we identified. Communities actually living in communities where there was an operational fund had no idea there was a fund there. So a map, a visual map where you could log on and think, oh, okay, there's a fund in the local area that I can actually apply to, is the first step. We don't have that in Wales. So really trying to encourage sort of a register that is accessible by the public would be a first step in how communities can then influence these funds. There was another question then from Suzanne.
In just for a moment, Lydia, just to add the experience we've had here in Northwest Wales with the Gwerthni movement, which is a movement for community climate action. However, it used, sorry, I'm translating in my head, climate assemblies. Assemblies of people where we had 50 people in 5 separate communities. So that's 250 people. And these are, fairly small communities. So bringing 50 people together gave a real democratic edge to the decision making that was made there, giving them information, sharing with them what's possible. And they developed action plans in each of these areas. And the kind people at the National Lottery Climate Action Fund have then offered £2.5 million for us to help make those actions happen. Now, it doesn't have to be the National Lottery Fund that does that. And if there is a community benefit fund locally, then perhaps helping to fund some forms of these local democracies, like a assembly, may be a way for them to be more inclusive in the decision making around what happens with that money.
Definitely. And I should say as well, one thing we found from engaging with leading developers in Wales was that they had a concern that actually to set up the fund in a more impactful way that maybe is more transparent or has an independent charity and a board and a fund manager, or maybe a few members of staff, when they'd ask communities, do you want to fund, an element of the fund will have to be used to fund that. So do you want that to happen? Generally, the communities sort of say, well, no, you know, I don't want 50,000 maybe being taken out. So one, I think it could be the idea that actually developers pay for this outside of the fund, and a recognition that if you paid these roles, the funds would be better set up and have more impact. But also just more negotiation and explaining to communities then why setting up and using an element possibly of the fund to set up a more transparent system and with better governance structures would actually probably lead to, like you say, more engagement and sort of a better, more democratic use of funds. But yeah, I think the idea of citizens' assemblies is really, really interesting. Thanks, thanks, Grant. And then a question from Suzanne was, do you think that there needs to be a Climate Justice Act in Wales, which sets out parameters of transition for our industries, given Welsh Government's weak financial position and lack of government mandates, or do you think the Future Gens legislation covers it? If so, what's your vision for a Climate Justice Act in Wales? I can jump in first, and then we can go to others if they want to jump in. So I'm not really familiar with Climate Justice Act, and maybe I should be, so that's something for me to go and research a bit more. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned the Future Generations Act, because it's really impactful in discussions around climate justice and climate change. But the Future Generations Act isn't explicitly environmental or climate change act. It's, you know, it's across a range of topics. And so decisions obviously need to be made in mind of future generations. But that doesn't mean that they also have to be the most appropriate decision for climate, because they might be competing narratives then. But I think fundamentally the Future Generations Act as it is has been really useful to sort of underpin a lot of conversations, and particularly we reference it in this report because using that act you could say that actually we need to think of future generations. The past level of extraction of the past industrial revolution had no provision of future generations. It was just annual profit extraction, and once that closed there was not only no legacy, but a legacy of harm. So I think using the Future Generations Act and underpinning our report of saying renewable energy is renewable, but projects aren't. They do come to an end. So what is the long-term financial, economic, social benefit of projects? And I think that bill leads on to where we sort of pointed to with a sovereign wealth fund for Wales, and using the Future Generations Act to sort of underpin those claims. And I think you know, the Future Generations Act being quite a new act has done a lot, but now it's more for sort of the implementation of the act and excited to see where that goes. But I think, yeah, interesting to read more into a Climate Justice Act. Does anyone else want to come in on that one?
I'll jump this time if I can, Dan, if you don't mind. Just firstly, I want to say hello to Suzanne. Hi, nice to hear from you, Suzanne. I likewise don't know a huge amount about Climate Justice Act, but I wonder how it might be more effective than the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. Certainly, some of the learning perhaps from the Wellbeing Act is that we need to offer a bit more teeth with these types of acts so that they can have a greater impact. And I think if there was to be a Climate Justice Act, then we would need to really understand how we created those teeth and how those teeth were then able to be used. Have I gone too far with this analogy? It's metaphor, perhaps. I think that, you know, these are challenges. It sounds great idea. It's how might the implementation of that work?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, personally, I don't think Welsh Government needs to do much more, really. I think it's done a pretty good job in terms of setting the framework. You know, with the Future Generations Act, I mean, that's like an aspirational thing. You know, it certainly inspires me and the kind of commissioners that I've met through it. I'd be hesitant about a Climate Justice Act just because it absorbs so much energy, like doing anything like in the public sector and through government, politicians, and even then we will then get asked to be consulted on it. I kind of think, you know, we're living in a climate emergency. We've just got to get on with it. And I think there's enough that we can get on with now. I mean, for me, the opportunities are to continue what we've been doing with EGNI. Also, the shared ownership agenda. Again, Welsh Government's kind of set out an encouragement for developers there. And I think it's just up for people like Grant and me and others, Lydia, to kind of just get on with it and just make those opportunities happen, and probably to use the convening power of the Future Generations Commissioner, Derek Walker, to call on all the developers to sort of like pinpoint the ones that aren't doing it. People like, I'm not going to name them, but because they might change their mind, but I nearly did. But there are one or two that aren't engaging in shared ownership. The ones that are, RWE, ESB, Coriolis, Renantis, are great, and we need to kind of put pressure on the ones that aren't and use the Act, because it has got real power, soft power, which is probably the most important kind of power, to encourage the right kind of projects in Wales that sort of leave a legacy. So I'd sort of stay clear too much of any more public stuff, kind of build on what's already there, I think.
Yeah, I think
Thanks, Dan. Sorry, I just think that's brilliant, Dan. What you just said, what we have to do is look at what can we do right now and get on with doing it, because there's so much we can do. And sometimes we get lost in the faffing around with the bureaucracy. Thanks, Dan, for saying that.
Yeah, there's definitely a key challenge for delivery and implementation. I think the solutions are there, like Dan has said, of co-working, of partnerships with the commercial and community sector. And it's facilitating that, isn't it? And I should say that Derek also endorsed the paper, which is really kind and really, really impactful, actually, from the Future Generations Commissioner. But I wanted to raise something Dan mentioned there, which was around sort of, my brain has gone slightly empty there. What was I going to say? It was around, incentivizing business. That's the one. So I think one key thing is, well, how do we get developers to act? But actually they are, like, some are acting. And as Dan mentioned, RWE are actually delivering shared ownership. But I think also there needs to be an incentive, because what you sort of have now is, different developers doing different things, different levels of engagement, different commitment to community benefit funds. Some are giving, I think, 7,000. They've voluntarily committed to give more. We'd argue that it should be more like sort of 8 to 10,000 and beyond. But, there are developers that are actually overstepping the baseline, really, and actually giving a bit more. And then there are other developers that are doing far less and are, really not even delivering community benefit funds at all. But there's no real incentive for sort of being a developer that is doing more. And I think there could be key reforms sort of even within planning. Planning doesn't really look at the social value of projects. It assesses sort of environmental impacts and so on. But, planning is devolved to the Welsh Government. That we could move to a state where I know planning has just been reformed in Wales, so no one's going to be excited that I'm encouraging even more reforms to planning infrastructure. But essentially, do we look at projects and say, well, actually, this project has got not just a community benefit fund, they've also got a shared ownership. They're going to engage with the community sector and deliver a shared ownership model with someone like Awel Amantawe, or, for example, another community project. There's nothing in planning that actually compares projects like that. This project doesn't even give a community benefit fund. This one gives community benefit fund and shared ownership. So I think we need to look at how we can actually reform planning and actually incentivize that the projects that are going above and beyond and actually delivering social value and shared ownership, well, they get consented first before the projects that don't. And I think you then reward developers that are acting well, that, RWE, they're actually delivering shared ownership. But you also pressurize those that aren't delivering that. Well, there's a benefit for them to start doing it. And while we'd love the private sector to deliver because of the values base, actually maybe providing an incentive like earlier access to sort of consenting and planning, then that might be a way that we can stimulate sort of better projects. So I think that's something that we could also push for. And then there's a final question in the Q&A box from Gwendolyn. And so this says, would developers welcome greater co-production with communities to bring more shared power? And can the Future Generations Act in Wales be used to facilitate this? So I think we've sort of already covered some of this, but if anyone has anything else to sort of bring in, one thing I think I'd say with shared ownership, would be that it would possibly be useful to have, sort of how the Welsh Government is facilitating, maybe being a bit of a middleman. And I'm not sure, Dan, if you can speak to this, but some developers argue that in developing shared ownership, there's a bit of a frustration between developers and maybe the community, with the community are maybe a bit distrusting of the developer. So is there space then, I guess, for Welsh Government, a middleman in facilitating that sort of negotiations then?
Yeah, I think that's the natural role for Community Energy Wales to help facilitate those discussions, and they are doing that. There's one of the projects I put up in the chat was the Alwyn's wind farm, which is jointly with RWE up in North Wales, and it's a matter of capacity. It does take time to negotiate these kind of shared ownership projects, so it sort of makes sense for Community Energy Wales to sort of take the lead on that, and then set up a new co-ops when those projects, if they get planning consent. Yeah, so again, I wouldn't look to Welsh Government to kind of do that. I mean, developers quite often will say, oh, they've talked to the community and they don't want to do the shared ownership thing. That just basically means the developers don't want to do it, and they've talked to like a few people locally who probably have no idea what the developer is talking about. And that's that. We need to establish a clear route by which shared ownership can be established, and I think that's best done through Community Energy Wales or by local groups. In our area, we are working on a few projects because Neath Talbot is a bit of a hotbed basically for wind farms. Yeah, but we need a range of organisations to be involved, and Gower Power are also involved in one in Swansea as well. A big solar farm.
Great, that's really useful. Thanks, Dan. I'm just checking if there's any questions that we've missed. I know there was two for yourself, Dan. I'm not sure if you answered them on in the chat function on how much the local school cost to refurbish.
I did actually. It's about 2.5 million.
Wow.
We could have practically built a new school for that.
What has the reaction been in the community then? Because obviously that's salvaging, a much loved building, and yeah, I guess what was the perception of that?
Yeah, no, it's been amazing actually. People have been really keen to participate, and it is. Everyone's got so many memories of the school. So yeah, people are just really pleased. It's not open yet. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that community energy can sort of open up, really, of those sorts of opportunities, or things like what Grant said about the local pub as well. Ironically, we're actually also involved in looking at buying a local pub as well. Yeah, so these sorts of community facilities, if you're following an asset-based approach, can then work within the community sector, or at least they can be kept open.
That's really interesting because, in our own, the IAA's work of sort of community ownership, and there's evidently an issue of, redundant derelict buildings across towns. And I think it's quite interesting how community energy can facilitate, the buy-in of those buildings and reinvest in the local community. And I think the hub is going to be used for various different activities, isn't it, Dan? So, can really have a local impact within the community as well. Grant, did you have anything to add, or I'm just going to bring in a question from Paul?
I can talk so much. I might just fill until we run out of time so that Paul's question doesn't get asked, because Paul always asks the difficult ones. Thanks, Paul, for your question. But I was just going to add, I said when I started my presentation, look at this picture here of Shop Griffiths and Pennygroes. I want to come back to that, and then I forgot to come back to it. So maybe now's the opportunity, because that's about buildings that were left derelict in a high street that was, slowly going down. And they first bought an old ironmonger's Shop Griffiths, and converted that into a cafe downstairs, and accommodation upstairs, and a meeting room. And then they bought the one next door to it. And they bought out the back, they've got the workshop that's now the media centre for young people, and that's got solar panels on it, and then there's a battery in there. And they've bought Cymru Fydd, which is the next building up the hill again. They've got 5 buildings there now that they've been able to develop, all through community ownership, all full and busy and providing much needed services to the local community. And it's so uplifting to go and see, because not only is it because those buildings are back alive again, but because it's local people, it's locally owned again, they care about how it looks. They care about what hours it's open, and the social value of having it open. It's a bit like the pub just up the road here that we bought as a community as well. Commercially, maybe it doesn't make sense for it to be open every single night of the week, but we can make it work being open every single night of the week, because it's important to some people to have somewhere to go and meet, to see other people and have a chat with them. And that's the heart of what communities are really about. A commercial organisation wouldn't look at it with that heart, would they? Because they have to look at it with their shareholders in mind.
Great, thanks, Grant. I think there's 2 of Paul's questions I could roll into one. And if you just had one key piece of advice. So one question from Paul was, what are the key measures Welsh Government can take to scale this up? So by this, I think he means sort of community energy projects. And the other question was, how best can Welsh Government incentivise commercial developers? I can go first if you want, while people think. I think one thing on the community energy front would be that in establishing a Wales Wealth Fund, I think it's great that we'd have the money, but it's a question of the future really. But to think of now is, what would that money be used for? And one of the key constraints within the community energy sector is it's heavily based on voluntary work, people doing it alongside jobs, often unpaid, and the financing to support communities, particularly marginalised communities. Inner city, urban community energy doesn't really happen in Wales very much. And that's where a lot of inner city poverty takes place. So I think actually not only Welsh Government, but we could even use things like community benefit funds to facilitate and fund, in my opinion, the community energy sector, because that gives resilience, that gives economic and social benefit. So I think it's not just the Welsh Government to fund this. I think actually there's a role to utilise and maybe top slice, aggregate a level of community benefit funding for community energy to reinvest that way. So you're using sort of the large scale projects to invest in the sort of bottom up projects. But I also think in establishing a Wales Wealth Fund, we really need those conversations now of how we use the funds, and with the devolution of the Crown Estate, if that is to be devolved, what are those funds going to be used for? And to me, it makes sense that they'd be used to sort of further community energy schemes. And then in terms of incentivising, I think one thing that would actually be quite effective, and I'd be interested in seeing it, would actually be something as simple as a resourced community benefit funds map. I think having a really public domain that identifies these developers are giving all of this, these developers aren't, these developers are giving some. I think actually just it being very visual and open to public and communities to understand, oh, actually, I thought this was a bad deal, but perhaps that's quite a good one. And actually, I thought, not having a community benefit fund was normal, but I'm going to now go and negotiate with my local authority and developer to have a conversation around, actually, I think you should be giving us more money. I think that would incentivise probably a more even playing field. And conversations with civil servants in Scottish governments, that's what they've found. They've found that since having that public facing map, the community benefit funds haven't necessarily increased, but they have evened, and the provision of funding has become more fair than across communities. So I think that's one quite cost effective step really. But over to you two.
Such a good answer, Lydia. And we've got such an informed group of people here asking these difficult questions. I was just reflecting on Paul Allen asking questions. Paul from the Centre for Alternative Technology, leading Zero Carbon Britain. Paul, I want to listen to you give me answers. I'm not sure what Welsh Government should be doing to incentivise commercial developers, to be honest. I think what I can talk to is more about what is it local people can do to create greater benefit locally, and what can we do in our local communities in spite of these challenges that are posed.
Dan?
Well, I would say, yeah, it's transparency. So that register that Lydia mentioned, I really want Community Energy Wales to sort of do that register. Basically, I just think we're crying out for it, really. But then in terms of Welsh Government, like obviously we want to report on targets and where we are with that. There are various targets around, but one useful thing would be for to collate how much community energy is established each year, by kilowatt peak, because Wales has got a lot of schemes and there's more in development. So I think that, and it's linking it to the legal entity as well. So, charities, co-ops, KICs, what has been established by those entities. And I also think it's really important that Community Energy Wales is the entity that is paid to collect that data. At the moment we kind of go out to sort of tender on these things, which is nuts, really, because it just means you've got external organisations not in Wales who end up retaining all of that intellectual property, that knowledge, and can sort of win further tenders on the back of that. We need Community Energy Wales to be just doing that work, if not by direct award, but just finding a mechanism by which the procurement can be weighted in their favour, to kind of collect that data, because it'd be easy. They just email all their members, basically, but then make that document public, and kind of we can then get momentum. And I think the other thing is, as part of that register, that it's not just for commercial developers, but it's also for community developers like Our Lamb and Tower, so that we can then say, right, this is what our community benefit fund is per year. So we can then get the comparison. And it's just better to be transparent about this stuff. I think last year, the wind farm put about £200,000 into the charity, and this year is going to be about 400,000. So it's massively different and transformative, really, compared to a commercial wind farm. That's not to say that we don't need commercial wind farms, but we just need that data to be public and transparent so we can all kind of assess it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be interesting as well to see if Wales could take a lead on moving beyond community benefit funds. Like we've said, I think they'll always have their place. I think communities, are receptive to the fact that they have a local element of economic benefit then. But I think the examples from Canada, for example, of indigenous ownership, there's equity ownership, limited partnership, general partnership, and indigenous ownership. And you can have full indigenous ownership, or you can have sort of levels. And that is facilitated by different finance models and skills sharing. But I think we really need to be looking at these countries that are doing a completely different. If you've got a community that part owns the project, then a community benefit fund becomes, like pennies, really. So I think also from me would be that we move beyond just community benefit fund. Currently, that seems within conversations to be it. And I think, the shared ownership model, but also real efforts to actually support marginalised people in poverty to actually have a share. Well, if they can't buy shares, instead of community benefit fund, or maybe alongside community benefit fund, the developer, gives an element of shares to people within a certain proximity. I think these are quite forward-thinking ideas that maybe not happening across Wales and the UK, but why not trial them? I think community benefit funds can't be, it can't be as good as it gets then, but they're definitely a start and could do with some reform. Grant, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, there's a Wallace George has said in the chat, and I think this is in response perhaps to Paul's question as well, that planning policy, we could make a case to replicate affordable housing guidance so that community energy organisations be named as preferred partners to secure private developers' planning consent. What a great idea. Yeah, so how we use planning, I think, is key for us. And I was reminded of two examples by Dan when he was talking. One was about he mentioned tendering, and locally we've just had to tender or share an expression of interest actually to develop a hydro scheme locally to Natural Resource Wales.
Yeah.
And we thought that perhaps, given the development of Trydan Gwerth Cymru, the renewable energy developer for Wales, that as a community organisation, we'd be very well placed to be able to develop this project because of all the extra benefits we bring in. But we've been asked to, if we would be willing to work in collaboration with a private organisation that has also expressed an interest in developing this. And I don't understand why they're even asking the question, because obviously it's much better for Wales if the community organisations develop it than a private organisation where the profits go elsewhere. So that was a real surprise to me that that's happening at the moment. And then the other thing I was reminded of was just about how we use community benefit funds as well, or as Dan was saying, the wind turbines being able to provide that level of money into the charity. And in Teg, what we've been doing with our surpluses, I guess our profits, every year is not only reinvesting back into the local community and making donations to things like the local food bank and Shelter Cymru and things like that. We've also reinvested the profits back into the team to develop a team of community energy development managers. So we now have a team of staff who are working to develop other projects all over Wales to help other community energy organisations to bring in capacity and expertise, or to develop them where otherwise there isn't a community organisation there ready to develop. And I think that's a clever way. I'm allowed to say that as part of Teg. It's a clever way of us using these profits to build a momentum and to roll on to even bigger things.
Yeah, definitely. And building that capacity and understanding for the sector, and being able to further it across Wales. Thanks, Grant. And just bringing to a close then, I just wanted to say thanks to our audience, and really engaged audience, and some really great questions there. Thanks for all your questions. And also a big thank you to Opus and the Festival Debate and Chiwe for helping facilitate today's event. And thanks to Grant and Dan for coming along and sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for the invites. Thanks everybody for the great questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.